Okay, it's March the 4th, and I'm starting this recording a little early. It's about 4 minutes before this seminar is scheduled to begin. So my plan today is to first address any student questions. This is for Comm 101 public speaking online, and students often have struggles with basic technology, who to contact, how do I find what I'm looking for in Blackboard. So I'm going to start with a little discussion about that. And then I'm going to move into the overall objectives of this next speech, which is the informative speech. So I've created a few documents, and I'm going to share those documents, and hopefully I'm going to be able to take notes of what questions or comments the students have and what my responses are, so that then I can take those notes, store them in a Word document, and somehow make those available when we see fit. I'm not sure exactly how that will be. I mean, I could make them available in my individual Blackboard course, but I think it might be nice if it be available in a broader perspective. I think that's kind of the point here. Nobody has logged in yet. It is now 3 minutes before the webinar is supposed to begin. Nobody's here other than me. I did have 3 people sign up, so I guess I'll just kind of hang out here and see if anyone else appears. Okay, it's 9 o'clock. Still don't have any other attendees. Some other comments. I did create a few polls. I was going to send out the polls, just asking students of how they're feeling about taking this class online, and if they've hit any roadblocks yet and what those have been. I also wanted to get a sense of where in the state these students are from, but I'm just not sure any of them are going to show up. Still waiting. Okay, it's 5 after 9. I don't have anybody here yet. I'm a little concerned. I'm not quite sure what to do about this. I'm waiting to see if I hear back from anyone.
The SCAR Project is an exhibit out of New York by photographer David J. And it's an exhibit of 30 large-scale photographs of young women with breast cancer. David J. came up with the name SCAR Project. You know, he's showing women scars and all, emotional scars, physical scars, really capturing what these women go through. It's such a different exhibit. It's raw, it's real, it's beautiful. It puts a face to the experience. It's not just a stat anymore. It's a story. It's a life. I think that's all brought to the forefront when you see these images. It feels like after the treatment phase is done, people expect life to go back to normal. And sometimes it does feel normal, but then sometimes you get the flashes of, I'm not normal. I've got these scars, and how can people expect me to go back to normal? You might think seeing a breast cancer scar, oh, that's ugly, that's scary. But yet when you see these images, they're raw, they're unflinching, and yet they're beautiful and they're empowering. The photographs show an issue that's difficult to just talk about. And so I think that that's what people should walk away with is, life after breast cancer. What it means to be there and how you can help somebody to be there as well. We heard one woman tell us, and it was so beautiful the way she said it. She said, the whole point of bringing the SCAR project to Toronto is so that we don't need the SCAR project anymore.
Okay. Okay, it's 9:15, and I still don't see anybody here. So it looks like, though, that I'm going to I'm going to go ahead with my plans for the day, and we'll see if anybody joins us and what we can do with this. So the plan for today was to talk about the terms you see in front of you: coherence, clarity, credibility, fluency, and dynamism. These are kind of general points or general goals that we have in any public speaking situation. So I kind of wanted to get students' thoughts about what they thought each one of these terms means. And so as there's not anybody here, I just want to talk about it for a little bit. And something I wanted to do was direct you to the book. Now, I know that this course is being taught now in kind of an unusual way, in that for many of us, in that the book is embedded and the links are there in Blackboard. So I'm going to take you back to the starting point of what it would initially look like when you first enter your Comm 101 online course. And so here we have the entry point for my particular Comm 101 section. And you know that as you work through the course, you go through these class session files, and in each one of these class session files are links to the content in the textbook. But if you ever want to kind of just enter this from an overview of the book, as if you were just opening the book, sitting there at your desk, taking it off the shelf and opening it up, the way to get to the book that way is through the resources link. And if you go to the resources link, you'll see right there the Art of Public Speaking. So before we enter that, though, I want to show you something else here that's helpful. You will also see all the speech guidelines, some outline examples, the rubrics that your instructor has loaded for the course, and these files to help you figure out how to compress your videos. So many students have difficulty getting their videos to load to Connect, which is our video sharing service that we use that's attached to your textbook. So if you ever get stuck there, please open this resources file and look at the help with compressing videos as well as the McGraw-Hill Connect student guide. Those two bits of information are really invaluable. So anyway, let's scroll. I'm going to scroll back up, and I am going to open The Art of Public Speaking, the 11th edition. I've chosen to do this today because I get the impression many times that students, at least in my sections, we all are generally good speakers at this point in our lives. We can carry on a conversation, we can construct a sentence, we're comfortable with language. So sometimes we enter this course kind of with this misconception that if we have a basic comfort with the language, that we're going to do fine in the class. And as a result, I get the impression as I read students' discussion boards postings and look at the work they submitted that sometimes that sense of I'm good with this directs them to not open the textbook. And in order to be really successful in the class, you really have to use the book. So I'm going to reinforce today some of the things that are in the book that you can refer to, outside of this synchronous learning event. And I'm hoping that as we move forward in this class that you'll refer to the book a little more frequently than perhaps you originally were. So the first term we're going to talk about is coherence. And there's kind of this cool thing up here in this book, and that is if you type in coherence, if you type in the term, you can search the book. Now, see over here the search bars. So I'm going to click on that, and that's going to take me to this notion of coherence. I'm going to flip this over so we can look at this a little more effectively. Here it is. So let's just read through this for a moment. In a classic study, a college professor took a well-organized speech and scrambled it by randomly changing the order of its sentences. He then had a speaker deliver the original version to one group of listeners and the scrambled version to another group. After the speeches, he gave a test to see how well each group understood what they had heard. Not surprisingly, the group that heard the original unscrambled speech scored much higher than the other group. So a few years later, two professors repeated the exact same experiment at another school, but instead of testing how well the listeners comprehended each speech, they tested to see what effects the speeches had on the listeners' attitudes toward the speakers. They found that people who heard the well-organized speech believed the speaker to be much more competent and trustworthy than did those who heard the scrambled speech. So this is interesting. That tells us that not just the message itself was more effectively understood if the speech was well organized, but that you, the speaker, came out of that experience, with a higher level of credibility because the audience recognized that you were trustworthy and competent. That's how they described you. So 2 reasons why organization is important. Let's keep reading here for just a moment. These are just 2 of many studies that show the importance of organization in effective speech making. Listeners demand coherence. So normally here I would sort of ask you, what does coherence mean to you? For me, coherence, when I hear the word coherence, I immediately think of the opposite, which is incoherent. Somebody whose ideas aren't connected. I think of a situation with my mother. My mother was passed away a few years ago, and before she her life ended, she was struggling with coherence, and it was kind of charming, really, that she would randomly move back and forth through her life. So one moment I was a baby, and the next moment I was a woman of 45, and the next moment she was a young bride, and maybe a moment later she might be who she is today, and then all of a sudden she's 6 years old living with her large family in California. So you can see this jumping back and forth through life is incoherent. A speaker would never really want to be incoherent, to just jumping randomly back and forth from one idea to the next. And when you look back at this passage that's in front of you here in the book, listeners demand coherence. Unlike readers, they cannot flip back to a previous page if they have trouble grasping a speaker's ideas. Continuation of that notion, they also can't raise their hand and ask a question many times. You remember that would sort of conflict with what we thought, how we defined public speaking earlier in this class. So the book then goes on to discuss strategy. See there in italics, this requires that speeches be organized strategically. So at this point, we're talking about your next speech assignment, which is informative speaking. So many of you, all of you actually, have witnessed informative speaking because you're all students. And you all at some point in your life sat in a room and listened to somebody try to teach you something. Now, as you reflect on those kind of experiences, I would say, have you ever had an instructor or a teacher that kind of jumped around? It felt like sort of a random experience, like first I'm going to tell you about this, and then I'm going to tell you about that, and then I'm going to tell you about this, and it didn't seem to have a flow, a connection of one point to the other. That learning experience was probably pretty frustrating. So applying that concept to your being the person who's teaching, because you're going to be delivering an informative speech, the goal is that you don't jump around randomly from one idea to the next, but instead that you have a clearly planned strategy, that your ideas move from one to the other. So I encourage you to read this chapter, and I believe that this is chapter 9 about organizing the body of the speech, now that we have this notion of coherence in mind. So that was our first term for the day. Everything is connected. The main points flow from one to the other. Okay, so another goal that we have in public speaking is clarity. Now, clarity is a little different from coherence. So coherence means that you've developed a clear train of thought, that your train of thought is progressing, forward, and it's easy for someone to follow in that train of thought. Clarity means that I can understand what you're saying, like that the words all make sense, that you're clearly conveying a message. So I know it's terrible to use the word clearly to explain clarity. So let me step back from that. That it's easy to understand what you're saying. It's easy to understand the idea. You remember way back in the start of this class, the discussion was about what is communication. And communication occurs when somebody has an idea. I have an idea, something in my brain that I want to share this message, this idea with someone else. And so the speaker, the person in this communication event, encodes. And that means they choose the words, they choose the nonverbal cues, they choose the symbols that they think best convey that message. That simple process of encoding is really important when you're planning an informative speech. You have to give consideration to what is the best word you can use to convey the message in the image in your brain, so that when the receiver, in this case the audience, hears those words, they decode, they extract a similar meaning, a similar idea. So clarity is an important consideration or an important goal for an outcome in informative speaking. So think about how you'll say. the ideas. And really, unlike when we're kind of writing a paper in a speech, the simpler, the better is true. Okay, the third term I have up here is credibility. By this point in this class, because we're halfway through the semester now, you have all developed a certain level of credibility. When you stand up in front of your audience, if it's the same audience you've been speaking to already, each one of those people already have a view of your credibility, of your competence, of the value that you bring to that public speaking situation. If you've been also in the same group uploading your videos to other people in the group and they've all watched them, then each one of those people that are watching you, via the beauty of technology, have an idea of how you're going to perform as a speaker. So you already have established credibility. Now your goal in this informative speech is to expand on that credibility. Your goal is that when the speech is over, your credibility is higher or at least equal to the credibility you had when you started. And so how do we do that? How do we build credibility? Well, certainly we build credibility with delivery. What we look like, what we sound like, that certainly builds credibility. But at a more base level, we build credibility by drawing from the credibility of others. So we build credibility by using evidence from qualified, credentialed sources. That builds our credibility. So that would mean for this informative speech, if you look at the speech assignment, they have embedded in there some requirements for references. So let's take a moment and look at that. So we're going to go back to the course. And if you look at the resources tab again, and you scroll down to the speech guidelines, let's open up speech number 3, the informative speech. It should pop right up for you. Okay. So I'm going to go down to sources. In this class, in this speech, you are required to have 3 sources. And notice that there's one discussion of what those sources should be here in this assignment. Consider the legitimacy, recency, credibility, balance, and accuracy of your sources. So by considering each one of those, of course, what you're doing here is you're building your personal credibility. And more than that, not just you borrow the information from the sources, but in the speech itself, you need to state who the source is and why they're qualified. Not just the statistic, fact, quote, example, or whatever type of supporting evidence you borrowed. You need to cite the source. And the reason you do that is because this word that we're talking about here, which is credibility. You cite the source because you're borrowing from the credibility of the source itself. So with that in mind, we can certainly see that there's a big difference between citing Wikipedia and citing the Wall Street Journal, or citing USA Today and citing the Wall Street Journal. The big difference is that the credibility is much higher for the one source, the Wall Street Journal, and the credibility is significantly lower for Wikipedia. And so that's why here it says a database, Wikipedia, and I'm right here, is not a source. It's a compilation of information from many sources. So if you are a Wikipedia user, we all use Wikipedia, and you've probably heard this before in your English classes, but if you're a Wikipedia user, since it's a database, a compilation of information from many sources, I would recommend that you scroll down to the bottom of whatever you're reading on Wikipedia and see the original sources that article drew from. Look up those sources And those sources may well be credible and sources that will build your credibility that you can cite from them in a speech. So your sources must be cited out loud in your speech itself because that builds your credibility. Your instructor will want to see in the preparation outline, which remember is the completely developed outline for your speech, the instructor will want to see where that evidence came from. So you'll also have to cite them in the outline itself. And then you'll also need to submit a bibliography or a works cited list that gives all the details about that source. And the reason that you're being asked to do this isn't just because, we like to make you work hard or a painful experience. It's because it builds credibility. So these three concepts, coherence, clarity, and credibility, those are all things that you can control. These are all things that you can meet. These are all measures that you can meet by organizing your speech ahead of time, by researching the topic of your speech, and by looking for the best evidence that you can find. Now, the bottom two factors here, fluency and dynamism, these are really more delivery descriptives. What do you look like, and what do you sound like when you deliver a speech? Fluency means that you can basically share that information from beginning to end without a whole lot of stumbles, without a whole lot of blank moments when you forgot what was going to happen next. Fluency means you're comfortable with the language, that you can pronounce all the terms that are there. So fluency just refers to your basic comfort and skill level when you're standing in front of a group of people. Dynamism is sort of that fluency turned up a notch because dynamism refers to energy. So being dynamic in delivering a speech means you're energetic, you're polished, you're professional, you're compelling. It's difficult to not listen to you. I want to listen to you, not just because I know you or you're my friend, but because the message that you're sharing it in such a way that it's interesting, it's compelling. That's dynamism. So, mark that away. So, fluency and dynamism, you can see, are really an extension of how well prepared you are. Coherence, everything's connected. Clarity, the language itself is easy to understand. And credibility, the ideas are supported with clear evidence. If you've planned for each one of those three, then you will have a fluent and perhaps even a dynamic presentation. If you haven't planned, if you've kind of put this off to the moment before, then what usually happens is you become anxious, become nervous. You're not quite sure if you've met the goal of the assignment. You're not really sure that you're well prepared, or perhaps even you're sure that you're not well prepared. And so the end result is that your fluency is it is compromised, that there's breaks where you're not sure what comes next, that you're perhaps focused on your notes or focused on a PowerPoint presentation if you have one, and not focused on engaging the audience, that you have all these results, you have all these behaviors that demonstrate or show the audience that you're really just not prepared. It's next to impossible to be fluent and dynamic if you aren't coherent, clear, and credible. What happens when you plan for the first three is it boosts your feeling of comfort, that you have the situation, that you're, I got that. So my daughter always says when she plays softball, I got this, I got this. And so that's how you feel when you've planned a message. And when you feel that way and you think that way, then your final delivery will be fluent and dynamic. Now, the reason I'm spending some time talking about this is because I have students all the time that, because they're comfortable in front of a group of people, they don't plan because they think the speech is all about just the delivery, or this class is all about delivery. And it isn't. The class is also about organization, because the thought in higher education, the thought of studying public speaking as an art form or as a form of personal expression, is that the delivery is the outcome of the planning. So coherence, clarity, credibility, planning each one of these results in a fluent, dynamic presentation. All right, let me go back to, I'm going to show you something else here. As we're thinking about this next speech, and this is for your informative speech, these are the steps, the early steps of planning a speech that have been presented in your book, and yeah, we are going to look at the book again. But the first one is determine the general purpose. At the top of your outline or at the forefront of your thoughts should be, what is your overall goal here? For this next speech, your overall goal is to be informative. So it's for your audience to be able to understand something that perhaps they didn't understand before, or to understand something in a new light. So your general purpose is either to inform, to persuade, or to entertain. With that in mind, because that's pretty much given to you in this class with your speech assignments, in the real world you'd have to determine that according to what's appropriate for the setting and what whoever the stakeholders are expect from you. You know, whoever asked you to stand up and give a speech probably expects something from you. So you would have to determine what that is. Secondly, your goal is to, second step is to choose a topic. This should be something you're interested in. And so I've listed here just some simple bulleted points that you can kind of go through. You should just do some basic reading. You know, I'm not a huge user of social media, but one of the ways I do use social media is I link to certain topics, you know, like interest groups about topics that I'm interested in. Like I follow a lot of groups that deal with public policy, dealing with education. I also am interested in the environment, so I have a few tabs or connections to organizations that deal with environmental issues. So just by reading through my Facebook page, I can read about topics that I've identified that I'm interested in. And if I find something in that, whatever shows up for the day that I'm really interested in, like something showed up today in my on my Facebook page, it was about, you know, those Keurig coffee makers and the little containers that the coffee comes in. They're called K-cups. Those little plastic containers that have a metal lid that's sealed to it. You know, and you pop that in there. It's very convenient. Well, this thing has showed up in my Facebook page, which was about the environmental impact of these Keurig coffee makers. And you can imagine it, the environmental impact is pretty negative. It's pretty significant. So that might be something I'd be interested in. So I would click on that, read it, maybe then do a basic search and try and see if this is a topic that I'm really interested in, that I think I can turn into a speech. I might ask questions about the topic. Like I might ask, well, gosh, aren't there some of these K-cups that are made out of recycled materials or that are biodegradable, you know, that they could in fact break down, or is there some reusable alternative to these K-cups? So I might ask people that I know that have these Keurig coffee makers, or these, they are not all Keurig, they're different brands, but these individual serve coffee makers, why they use the coffee maker and where they buy those cups, and what do they do with a cup when they're finished with the coffee, and that type of thing. So I might have a conversation with somebody, record some questions that I have, use social media, like I said here, to figure out what people know. I might actually post this on take that link and share it and see if any of my friends respond and see what they say. So choosing a topic means not just thinking about what you're interested in, but seeing what other people are interested in, or seeing what they understand about that topic. And the beauty of social media is it's a way for you to do that. The beauty of having someone you can talk to, even just casually, is it's a way for you to figure out, gosh, is this a topic I could turn into a speech? You don't even have to tell people you're thinking about this for a speech. Just, you know, here's something I've read about and I'm curious what you think. So from choosing a topic, now you write the specific purpose. Now let's keep in mind the specific purpose and the general purpose are two different things. The specific purpose focuses on a desired audience outcome. So my audience will what? What will they do after hearing this speech? I'm going to go back to, remember, the book, and we're going to pull up some information I've already highlighted for specific purposes. So I'm going to ask you to look, if you're following along with me, see down here in the bottom, there's a page number. if you haven't figured out how to navigate this, we're going to look at this a little bit. Page 82 is where I'm going to go, because page 82 begins to talk about a general purpose and a specific purpose. I so often have students not seem to understand what a specific purpose is, and then what the next goal is, which is to which is the central idea. So we're going to refer to the book because it's something you can look back at to kind of talk about the central idea and the specific purpose, which I would just sort of going to remove my highlighting now. Okay, so here we go. So we know what the general purpose is, right? So in this situation, it's to inform. And the specific purpose focuses on one aspect of a topic. It should be a single infinitive phrase that indicates precisely what you hope to accomplish with your speech. And the book goes through an example, but I'd like to just keep going down here. So tips for formulating the specific purpose statement. It is the most important early step in developing a successful speech. What the specific purpose is really doing is it's limiting the focus of your speech. You're making sure that you really know what the impact is that you want to have on the audience, and with that in the forefront of your mind, you can come up with strategies of how you're going to get there. So the specific purpose doesn't say, well, I'm going to talk about K-cups, or I'm going to talk about coffee. The specific purpose says, what will you, the audience who's listening to my speech, learn as a result of this speech? So my audience will what? This is an informative speech. It's not a persuasive speech. So it should be a learning outcome. My audience will recognize the environmental impact of single-serve coffee. That would be a specific purpose. So write the purpose statement as a full infinitive phrase, not as a fragment, to inform my audience about the three major kinds of 3D technology. Is a full infinitive phrase, infinitive meaning it's starting with to. I tend to like to start a specific purpose with my audience will. So an infinitive phrase is not a complete sentence. You could start it that way, or you could start it my default mode, which is my audience will. This is always a statement, never a question, because it's not what will your audience do, but what will your audience? You have to answer the question. Figurative language doesn't belong in a specific purpose. So figurative language to persuade my audience that the campus policy on student parking really stinks. The word stinks is figurative, right? Because it implies that this policy has the ability to have an odor, and it doesn't. So figurative language can't be in your specific purpose. Your specific purpose needs to have one distinct idea. So ineffective here, to persuade my audience to become literacy tutors and to donate time to the Special Olympics. That word "and" shows you that there's two clauses, there's two ideas in that sentence. It should be one idea, to persuade my audience to become literacy tutors, or to persuade my audience to donate time to the Special Olympics. Now these examples really won't work, aren't applicable to the informative speech, because these are persuasive outcomes. But this notion of a specific purpose, what we're talking about here, is the same basic understanding, the same basic concepts can be applied in both the informative and the persuasive speech. All right, the next guideline, make sure your specific purpose is not too vague or general. To persuade my audience that something should be done about unsafe school buses is kind of vague, because what is it you want to be done? To persuade my audience the federal government should impose stronger safety standards for school buses in the United States, you might want to say that there should be seat belts on school buses, that there should be some type of airbag type of device on a school bus. So they should be specific, not vague, and not general. So you can read through this in the book. Questions to ask yourself once you've developed your specific purpose. Does it meet the assignment? So is the specific purpose an informative outcome that draws from research that's a topic of significance to the audience in this class? And can you accomplish that purpose in the time allotted? And I'm sorry, down below it jumps into, is this relevant to my audience? So this one is really important because sometimes students think, well, the struggle in choosing a topic or determining a specific purpose in a speech is it has to be something I'm interested in. Well, it does, but more than that, it needs to be something of relevance to an audience. I had a student in a class that wanted to give a speech about the World Wrestling Federation, WWF, or SmackDown, or something of that nature. And I kept saying to him, I don't really know that that has any relevance. I'm not interested in that, and how are you going to make that topic something of relevance to me? So the example they give here in the book, the price of retirement homes in Palm Springs, might be an engrossing topic for older citizens who are in the market for such dwellings. The quality of hot lunches in the elementary schools is of great concern to students who eat them, and of course the parents who pay for them. But neither subject has much relevance for an audience of college students. No matter how well you construct your speech, they are likely to fall flat unless you speak about matters of interest to your listeners. So the reason I'm accentuating this is because in this class, I know that you create or you gather 6 people to listen to you give the speech, and you might assume that those 6 people are your audience, but your audience is really, your intended audience are the college students that are enrolled in this course with you. So if you're all 6 people there in that room are fans of wrestling, SmackDown, I'm not even sure what the term is they use now, but you know what I'm talking about. That doesn't mean that this is a good choice for this assignment because the audience you're really directing this speech towards is college students. And it should be a topic that's, appropriate in an academic setting, something of significance in some way to the people that are enrolled in the class, not so much the 6 people you've gathered. So I kind of think of those 6 people more along the lines of props. They're not your final outcome of who you're trying to contact. So there's a checklist here in the book that repeats all these questions. I think you should look at that. Think about that in these early stages. The speech isn't due for a few more weeks, so think about this. Is this something that, is this specific purpose? Answer yes in all of these questions. So is the purpose too trivial for my audience? To inform my audience about the parts of a backpack, how to tie a bow tie, that's espresso is better than cappuccino. Those all might be too trivial for a college classroom. Are they too technical? Fermat's last theorem, neutrino physics, encryption technology, those all might be too technical unless you can easily break them down and show why the audience should know about those terms. So this specific purpose, if you refer back to here to this document we're looking at. This specific purpose is your goal. What's the impact you want to have on the audience? You don't say that in a speech. You wouldn't stand up in front of an audience and say, by the end of my speech, my audience will recognize the impact of K-cups on the environment. It just sounds awkward. Instead, you translate that into the central idea. The central idea is what you actually say in the speech. So to refer back again to the book, we're going to scroll down to page 89. Here we go. The central idea. The specific purpose of a speech is what you hope to accomplish. The central idea is a concise statement of what you expect to say. Sometimes we call it the thesis statement, the subject sentence, or the major thought. The reason I'm drawing you back to the book to talk about these is for a few reasons. One is I get the impression in teaching this class that some students don't really refer to the book frequently as a tool to help them in developing the speech in these early stages. And in these early stages, when you're thinking about your topic and how you're going to focus that topic, how you're going to mold it for the audience and for that assignment, the book is really invaluable in answering those questions. And when students don't take the time to look at the book and don't take the time to go through these early stages, the speeches often have a lack of focus. And a lack of focus is really the major cause of poor speeches. Major sign of a poorly thought out speech, or perhaps even I would say a untrained speech, and a speaker that hasn't been trained in the art of public speaking. So the central idea, this specific purpose, these are all really important. So the central idea is how you actually say the speech, the topic itself. Okay, so I also want to draw your attention to this term, residual message. Another way to think of the central idea is as your residual message, which is what you want your audience to remember after they have forgotten everything else in the speech. Most of the time, the central idea will encapsulate the main points to be developed in the body of the speech to show how this works. So they're going to go on to examples. So my point, though, is this. Here's the residual message, what a speaker wants the audience to remember after it has forgotten everything else in the speech. So this article that I read about K-cups this morning, I read a fair amount about it because I was just kind of curious, and I was sitting here waiting for people to log into this online webinar, and I really couldn't give you all the specific details about K-cups, what they're made of, how many are sold in any given year, how they're normally disposed of. But what I do know after reading all of this is the residual message of K-cups are an environmental nightmare. They're an unnecessary environmental nightmare even. So that's the residual message, what I remember after reading everything. Now look at these examples. Music therapy is the topic. The general purpose is to inform. The specific purpose, an infinitive phrase, to inform my audience about the benefits of music therapy for people with psychological or cognitive disabilities. That's the goal for the speech. And then music therapy, developed as a formal mode of treatment during the 20th century, utilizes a number of methods and is explained by several theories that account for its success. So that central idea, as it's stated there, shows how the speaker is going to move forward. So please be sure you take some time to read through and to consider what is your central idea. And the textbook offers guidelines similar to the guidelines for the well-worded specific purpose statement. It should be expressed in a full sentence, not a question. It's not a research question. It's an answer. It's a full sentence. It should not contain figurative language, and it should not be vague or overly general. So the book gives examples of poor ones. Paying college athletes a monthly salary is a good idea. Problems of fad diets. What are nanorobots? Robots. Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula is an awesome place for a vacation. So you can see each one of these kind of used what the book tells you to avoid. One's a question, one is figurative language, one is simply a phrase, one is a value judgment. So there's also a checklist here for your central ideas. Please take some time to look through that. Take some time to think about it. I know it feels like you just want to jump right in and get this speech over with. But before you jump right in, you really have to give some consideration to these early stages for planning a speech. So determine the general purpose, choose a topic, write the specific purpose, write the central idea. And now you'll see, we talked earlier about this notion of coherence. What's happening is you're starting these early phases are allowing you to develop this notion of coherence. Now, probably the best way to make sure that your speech is coherent is to choose a pattern of organization. And I think of this as a strategy. And when I talk about patterns of organization, I reflect on the early stages of my daughter learning how to play soccer. So my daughter started to play soccer when they were about 4 or 5, and maybe some of you can remember this. I would go out to the soccer field on Saturday morning, and this kind of funny thing would happen. They would, drop the ball or however they started the game, and then this sort of coagulated group of small people would sort of follow that ball all the way around the field. Whether it was down by one goal or down by the other goal, they would all chase the ball. So there was sort of this large group of life that was always surrounding the ball. And then you can imagine what happened is that very few goals were scored, because it was more like chase the ball, follow the ball, than it was work together to get the ball in the goal. One day I stuck around after my daughter's game with the 4 to 5-year-olds, and I watched this team play that were more at high school level of development. And it was amazing that no longer were they all following the ball. They had strategies in place for how they would get that ball down the field and to score in the goal. So they had a clear way to move the ball. There was a strategy. Public speaking is the same way. You don't just stand up and kind of randomly share bits of information that has some sort of loose connection to a topic. Instead, you have to have a strategy, a way for collecting and for organizing those bits of information and those ideas to result in the outcome that you planned. And these are patterns of organization. That's the strategy. That's the game plan. That's how you approach the topic. So there's questions here. How could you best approach explaining this topic well enough to enable your audience to accomplish the specific purpose? For your next informative speech, you have 4 options. You can organize the speech in a chronological pattern, spatial, a causal pattern, or a topical pattern. Now, normally here's where I would pause and I would ask you about, what are some of the speeches, the topics you're considering, and we would have a discussion about what one of these 4 patterns would best be utilized for the outcome you're hoping for. And maybe we even take one topic and look at it in multiple ways. Well, no one's here today, so I'm going to kind of wing this, and I guess we're going to look back for a basic overview about what these patterns are to the book again. And we're going to flip down now to page 169. So this chapter talks about patterns of organization, strategic order of main points. And the first one is chronologically. This is the very base way that we have been learning since we were just kids. Chronology means follow a time pattern. What happens first, second, and third. So here's the example of the Great Wall of China was built in 3 major stages. Building of the Great Wall began during the Qing Dynasty of 221 to 206 BC. New sections of the Great Wall were added during the Han Dynasty of 206 to 220 AD, and the Great Wall was completed during the Ming Dynasty of 1368 to 1644. So a chronology from the least recent to the most recent. It's also a good idea to use chronological order when you're talking about a process. So there are 3 main steps in laser-assisted corrective eye surgery. I've always kind of wondered how that worked. You see those signs all the time about laser surgery. And so that process of how that works follows a chronology. And the speaker has first a thin layer is sliced off the surface of the eye to expose the cornea. Second, an ultraviolet laser is used to reshape the cornea. Third, the thin layer sliced off at the beginning of the surgery is reaffixed to the eye. So you can clearly see how this chronological approach works really well to explain a process, even a really complicated process like laser eye surgery. Especially useful for informative speeches. So if you're thinking of explaining how something works for your informative speech, if you're going to trace the history of something, maybe a biography of somebody's life, the chronological approach would be really good. The spatial order is the next option. Follow a directional pattern. That is, the main points proceed from top to bottom, left to right, front to back, inside to outside, east to west, or some other route. So for example, a hurricane is made up of 3 parts going from inside to outside. At the center of the hurricane is the calm, cloud-free eye. Surrounding the eye is the eye wall, a dense ring of clouds that produces the most intense wind and rainfall. And rotating around the eye wall are large bands of clouds and precipitation called spiral rain bands. So you can see this is spatial from the very inside of the hurricane to the middle to the outside. Spatial can also be used to look at something geographically. Like if you have a topic, I have a student in one of my classes who's talking about public education vouchers, or choice scholarships is what we normally call those now these days in Indiana. And they're talking about how vouchers are used in different parts of the country. So vouchers are used most aggressively in, and she identifies the region. Vouchers are basically not used in this other region, and vouchers are really expanding in the Midwest. So to take a large area and divide it up into regions is a spatial approach, and it's a geographic approach. Here the example in the book is northern Italy is home to Venice and its world-famous canals. Central Italy is home to Rome and its historical treasures. And southern Italy is home to Sicily and its culinary traditions. So you can see that each area of Italy offers you something unique. Okay, causal. A method of speech organization in which the main points show a cause to effect relationship. So let's scroll down here and look at the example. The growing shortage of certified air traffic controllers threatens the safety of air travel. The U.S. aviation system faces a growing shortage of qualified air traffic controllers. If this shortage continues, it will create serious problems for airline safety. So here's the cause, and here's the effect. The other example, the causes for the collapse of Mayan civilization has not been fully explained. So here's the cause. I'm sorry, here's the effect, and here's the cause. This one kind of goes backwards. So because of its versatility, causal order can be used for both persuasive and informative speeches. We're going to skip problem solution and go down to topical, because today we're really looking at informative speaking. Topical order results when you divide the speech into subtopics, each of which becomes a main point in the speech. I kind of also think of topical as categories. If there's pre-existing categories, then the speech would be topical. So for example here, Josephine Baker was a multi-talented figure in the fight for racial justice. The different categories in which she was talented was as an entertainer, as a spy, and a civil rights activist. Notice that when you use topical construction, it doesn't mean you just randomly choose 3 ideas you want to talk about, but each one of those ideas are divided, or subdivisions of the speech topic in a logical and consistent manner. Each main point isolates one aspect of Baker's achievements. So suppose your main points look like this. As an entertainer, Baker captivated audiences in Europe and America. As a spy, Baker gathered information on Nazi activists in France during World War II. During the 1950s, Baker expanded her activities and the scope of her influence. This is not a good example of topical because the third main point isn't consistent with the rest of the points. It deals with a time period, and the others deal with roles of Baker. So I really caution you to use topical. When you use topical, it doesn't mean you just come up with, here's 3 things I want to talk about. And since it's not chronological, it's not spatial, and it's not cause to effect, gosh, it must be topical. That's not what it is. It's not like this dumping ground. Topical means each one of these main points bears the same relationship to one another and to the goal of the speech. So let's look at the next one. The United States should continue its program of space exploration because it produces a scientific knowledge, generates technological breakthroughs, and open access to natural resources. So you'll see that each one of these main points is parallel in form and bears the same relationship with one another and to the overall guiding central idea. So topical really does deal kind of with categories, criteria. It isn't just 3 random ideas. So for your informative speech, you should be choosing what organizational pattern you're going to use. And I'm going up to where this is explained here. The most common strategic orders are chronological and spatial and topical. On occasion, the causal or spatial pattern may also be used. And I would argue that you need to use, I would add to that you need to use topical with caution. You need to really be sure you understand what that pattern means. Okay, so again, the organizational strategy is what imposes order on your speech. And the organizational strategy is what builds coherence. Because you see, none of those are difficult. None of them are rocket science. They're all ways that you've learned. I'm sure you can easily understand what those organizational patterns mean. That's the whole point. When you organize a speech, you reflect on the ways that we learn, the ways that we understand. We understand by following sequences in time. We understand by breaking down the parts. We understand by understanding the cause and effect relationship. And we understand by looking at categories. A good speaker chooses an organizational pattern because it reflects ways that we understand. And when you skip this step, then what you have is sort of a random collection of ideas that are loosely connected to a topic. You don't have what we've really been talking about today, which is you don't have a coherent, clear message. All right. So once you've chosen your central idea, once you've chosen your pattern of organization, now is when you really begin to research. You really begin to research because you're trying to figure out, you're trying to find information that supports your basic way of approaching this topic. And then after you've researched and you've figured out that this approach that you've come up with is really going to work, now you write the main points of the preparation outline. And you make sure that there's at least 2 pieces of supporting evidence for each main point. And you cite the sources of the evidence in the outline. Notice the last thing I have listed here on this document is to write the introduction and conclusion. Now, let me tell you what students often do. Students often say, well, here's my topic I'm going to talk about. And here's the 3 main points I'm going to talk about. And then they start writing the introduction. Before they've really given any thought to, do they have enough evidence to support those points? And are the points themselves good points? I had a student once who was going to talk about bottled water. And so she decided the first thing she was going to talk about was the history of bottled water. When we started buying water, when people there was a consumer demand for bottled water and what companies kind of got in the business of bottling water. And that was all going to be one main point. She thought that was like the history of bottled water. And then the second thing she wanted to talk about was the quality of bottled water. Like, is it really different from the water you get in the tap? So she had this whole discussion of what is spring water, what is purified water, what is tap water. And then the last thing she wanted to talk about was ways that you could avoid bottled water. What you could do to have water conveniently available without buying it in a bottle. So she went from history to types to ways you could avoid it. That really didn't follow a clear pattern. And so remember when we were talking about the residual message, which is what you hope somebody remembers when your speech is over. Well, her approach, had she used that, was so vague, so not connected, not coherent, that the residual message was pretty much along the lines of, well, she talked about bottled water. That's not the goal. The goal is that there should be a learning result in an informative speech, and that occurs when you choose a pattern. This isn't something you just slap on at the end of the speech. It's something that you start from before you begin to write the main points. So, how to plan your speech. Right here. I would like you all to kind of have a look at this simple document, to look at some of the pages that I've talked about in the book. And I also had a sample outline I was going to look at. So let's look at one of these. These are 3 main points that a student turned into me. The student was interested in soap operas. Soap operas began during the 1930s as radio serials in America. People, as I mentioned earlier, people of every age, race, gender, and nationality watch soap operas. And of course, there are several criticisms of soap operas. What do you think is wrong with this? Gee, I'm sorry, autocorrect. I'm not liking that. What do you think is wrong with this outline? Well, the answer is they're 3 randomly connected ideas. They're not one clear, organized, coherent message. Let's look at another one. Now this one's much longer because this is actually the finished preparation outline. So I've highlighted the question or the main body points. What are the symptoms of obsessive compulsive personality disorder? And what are the causes of these symptoms? Those are the main points. So what would be the organizational pattern here? It would be causal because it's cause and effect. Symptoms are effects. So what's though wrong with the way these main points are written? They're written in the form of a question, and a well-designed speech, the main points aren't questions. The main points are answers. So I'm going to show you now, after editing. For a person to be diagnosed with obsessive compulsive personality disorder, they have most of 5 personal qualities to varying degrees. And then OCPD is caused by a combination of genetic predisposition and life events. So you see how when you take those main points and you turn them into clear statements, then the focus of the speech becomes so much more clear. The focus of the speech becomes coherent. So as you're working through these stages that I've been showing you of how to plan your speech, keep that in mind and notice that 2 pieces of supporting evidence for each speech or each main point. You'll see that here in this sample outline. Each main point is supported by at least 2 pieces of evidence. Okay, so I hope I've given you an overview of how the concepts that have been embedded in this Blackboard course and in the book are applied to every speaking event. So I hope now you have an understanding of how this process works. And my hope is that you would, hold on to this, think about this, and as you're hitting that moment of panic that many people have of, what am I going to give the speech about? Or you're thinking, gosh, I'm just going to use this paper that I wrote for another class and read it, that you'll see that those approaches, this panic approach, I don't really know how to begin, or I'm going to read something I've written for another course, don't really work because they don't go through these stages, these steps that we've been talking about today to result in a clear outcome, which is a clear preparation outline. And from a clear preparation outline, it is possible to have a fluent, energetic presentation. So that's everything I wanted to cover today. Normally I would take a few moments here to answer questions from you, and I had some polls planned. I didn't use those in class because there was today because there was no one here to answer the polls, but I'm hoping that this experience proves valuable in this online course, and that I am sure that the concepts we've talked about today will help you no matter what section of public speaking online you're taking.